So let me take you back on a journey to 1998 and we can talk about it. So here is Night of the Living Dead. This is the Criterion Blu-ray that came out a few years ago. I'll start by just reading the back, in case you haven't seen this film, but I'm sure a lot of you have. Shot outside Pittsburgh on a shoestring budget by a band of filmmakers determined to make their mark, Night of the Living Dead, directed by horror master George A. Romero, is a great story of independent cinema. A midnight hit turned box office smash that became one of the most influential films of all time. A deceptively simple tale of a group of strangers trapped in a farmhouse who find themselves fending off a horde of recently dead, flesh-eating ghouls. Romero's claustrophobic vision of a late 1960s America, literally tearing itself apart, rewrote the rules of the horror genre, combined a gruesome gore with acute social commentary, and quietly broke ground by casting a black actor, Dwayne Jones, in his lead role. Stark, haunting, and more relevant than ever, Night of the Living Dead is back. And on this Criterion you can see a bunch of special features. I discovered this film late one night on the Horror Channel, and I watched it on a little TV that I had in my bedroom. And you know, this is a time before the internet was getting popular, but a few years before I watched this, I had really got into playing Resident Evil on the PlayStation, and I remember playing that for the first time as well. It was Christmas Day. My brother had bought us, the family, a PlayStation, and we were all playing Resident Evil. And I really got into that concept of isolation, surviving these zombies that have come out of nowhere, or taken over the town folk, and then just holding up in like an abandoned location. That concept really struck a chord to me. And then I watched this a couple of years later. So I was already sort of into the genre a little bit from playing Resident Evil. So I watched Night of the Living Dead for the first time, and just the idea of having a small group of survivors in a remote farmhouse, hiding from these zombies, the neighbours, as George Romero described his zombies, you know, coming to feed off of the humans that are just trapped in this farmhouse, and they're completely isolated. And it made me think for the first time how making a film would be possible, with your friends. Like, I watched this film and I just wanted to make a film. I was like, you get a group of friends, get a camera, get a bunch of people in zombie makeup, go out in the woods, make a film. That's what Sam Raimi did with Evil Dead, and he was heavily inspired by George Romero, as well as Simon Pegg and Edgar Wright, who made Shaun of the Dead. So it kind of made making a film feel possible even for a normal person like me. I've had a few attempts at making interested in George Romero, not just George the filmmaker, but George as a person. And again, you know, we're in 1998, so you couldn't just look up on the internet who George was. I had to seek his films out. I had to try and rent them. I had to try and find them or buy them. But I also went to the library and I was looking for books on George Romero. And so I would go and find books. I would try to find his other films, not just the zombie ones, even though it weren't until a couple of years later that I actually saw his sequel to Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, for the first time. And I can talk about that in another video because I always remember the first time I watched Dawn of the Dead and my experience with that. And Dawn of the Dead is my favourite George Romero film. And he made other films that weren't in the horror genre, like Night Riders, which was George's most personal film. And he made other films like Creepshow, Night Riders, The Crazies, Season of the Witch, There's Always Vanilla, Bruiser, Land of the Dead. And all these films I had to seek out and find. And I was just trying to look at his whole back catalogue of films because I wanted to study his work and his type of filmmaking. And he's a very distinctive filmmaker. You can look at any one of his films and you know it's him. He had a very distinctive style, and I just loved the way he framed shots. And he used to shoot tons of footage, so he had a lot to play with in the editing room. And I always sort of took influence from that. It's always better to shoot more footage so you got more to play with later. So his shots are normally really short and sharp and snappy, but there's so much detail. He doesn't waste any time on screen. It's like he's always showing the detail. And so this film was just a massive inspiration to me. And it just made me think, I want to try and do this, you know, try and make a film. So again, listening to George talk about his films as well, like later, years later, you know, you've got YouTube now, you can find a lot of interviews of George and other filmmakers alike, and you can study their work, and you can listen talk about their work. And George is just a really funny guy, and he's a really brilliant filmmaker. So again, watching films, discovering films in the 90s was a very different experience than discovering films now on a streaming service. You're just kind of flicking through thumbnail after thumbnail. But when you was a kid or a teenager and you turned on the TV at like 1 o'clock in the morning and you saw a film like this out of nowhere, it left a big imprint on me. And again, you know, for those who never lived at this time, it's hard to understand what it was like to discover films this way. You just don't find films like that anymore. And I wish you did. I like streaming. I prefer physical media. But I just miss It's that sense of discovery and mystery that discovering films back then had. George Romero will always be my favourite filmmaker of all time, and it starts right here. But another film that inspired me as well as this one was the remake of Night of the Living Dead by Tom Savini. This is the new 4K steelbook that came out recently by Sony. My favourite remake of all time. It was directed by Tom Savini, who was George Romero's makeup artist for a lot of his films, especially the ones he made from Dawn of the Dead onwards, up until like the mid-90s, late 90s. But Tom Savini did a fantastic job with the remake, and I've probably watched this more times than the original because it's just got a lot of replay value. The film is in colour and there's a lot more gore effects, better gore effects. The special effects were a lot better. This is my favourite remake of all time. Those of you who don't know, Tom Savini is a special makeups effects guy, and he did a lot of George Romero's films. I think his first film was Dawn of the Dead, and then he did Day of the Dead, and he did makeup effects on Creepshow. He was on Night Riders, but that wasn't really a horror film. And I think he done a lot of makeup effects for Dario Argento as well, and he worked on some of the Friday the 13th franchise and done a bunch of stuff. Tom Savini's massive, I'm sure you know who he is. And I think a lot of people out there would probably agree that this is a really solid remake. I have to say, like, George Romero's version is the original. Like, it's the, it's George Romero's first film. But I really enjoyed this film. If you haven't seen these films, I highly recommend them. They changed my life. Literally. They got me interested in filmmaking from exploring George Romero's work. I then started getting more obsessed with other filmmakers, and then that was like a snowball effect into really getting into cinema and films, and other filmmakers that I will discuss in future videos. But George Romero is a very special filmmaker to me because his films did change my life, and I can't praise his work enough. Please leave any comments down below. I would love to hear from you if you've seen Night of the Living Dead or the remake, and how they might have affected you, or if you're a fan, or if you're not a fan. I'd love to hear your opinions on anything George Romero. I'd love to hear it. So that concludes my video on Night of the Living Dead. If you stuck around until the end, I really appreciate you, and hope to see